My name is Marin Kessler, 38 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've been the quiet one who kept Hanlon Manufacturing's systems running. I'm not flashy, not the type who fills a room with noise. I prefer order, routine, things that connect the way they should. Maybe that's why what happened that Tuesday morning felt like my entire existence was being unstitched in front of everyone. Craig, my manager, stood at the head of the conference table with a thick folder under his arm. 18 of us crowded into the room. Some were still settling laptops, pouring coffee, whispering weekend stories. I slipped into the last chair with my notebook balanced on my knee. I barely had time to breathe before Craig's lips pulled into a smirk that froze my stomach. "Your position doesn't exist anymore," he said. The words hung in the air, louder than the hum of the projector. For a second, I thought he meant someone else, some position in another department. But his eyes, sharp and satisfied, were on me. I don't understand," I heard myself say. My voice was thinner than I intended. Craig cleared his throat, adopting the false gravitas of a man who loved control. "Leadership has reviewed our organizational structure. Your role is redundant, effective immediately." The room shifted. A couple of people stared hard at their screens as if a sudden email had arrived. Someone coughed, too loud, too fast. My face burned. 5 years of long nights, of forgotten dinners, of silently keeping their factories humming, dismissed in 11 words. "There's a box at your desk," Craig added. "Security will escort you once you collect your things." He didn't even glance up from his folder. I turned to the faces around me, people I'd laughed with over vending machine coffee, people whose broken code or failed uploads I had quietly patched at midnight. Now they looked like strangers, trapped between pity and fear. Only Naomi, across the table, let her horror show. I stood, every nerve screaming, but my spine locked straight. I forced my hands not to tremble as I gathered my notebook. Dignity was the only thing left to carry. And with that, I walked out of the room, already dreading the waiting box at my desk. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have. My footsteps echoed against the tile as if the building itself wanted to underline my exile. When I reached my desk, a cardboard box already waited, flaps open like a silent demand. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting to wake up. 5 years of my life reduced to the space of a box. I pulled my chair out and began the ritual. My niece's mug with the crooked purple paint that read "Number 1 Aunt." The framed photo of my parents smiling in their backyard before Dad's heart attack. 3 thick binders of technical manuals I'd kept close because the company's official documentation was always a decade behind reality. I stacked them carefully, as though care could disguise the humiliation. Around me, the office carried on with forced normalcy. Fingers tapped keyboards, printers hummed, phones rang. But the quiet was too perfect, too pointed. I knew no one would meet my eyes. To acknowledge me would be to invite Craig's displeasure. And nobody wanted that, except Naomi. She sat 2 rows over, her screen angled toward me. Our gazes locked for a split second before she mouthed 2 words, "Call me." Her eyes burned with anger she couldn't voice. That flicker of solidarity was a lifeline in a room thick with cowardice. "Sorry, Marin." I glanced up. Luis, the security guard, stood awkwardly by the door. He was young, barely older than my interns used to be. His voice was soft, almost ashamed. I managed a nod, grateful for the humanity. I closed the flaps of the box, slid my notebook on top, and lifted it into my arms. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted by memories and the invisible years of unpaid recognition. Luis stepped closer, as if to offer help, but I shook my head. Pride kept me balanced. The walk to the glass doors stretched longer than it ever had. No one rose. No one spoke. The company I had poured myself into for half a decade let me vanish in silence. I stepped into the afternoon light with the box pressed against my chest. each stride carrying me further from the life I thought I had built. The sun glared off the windshield as I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building. I killed the engine but didn't move. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, tilted, one corner of the photo frame pressing against the glass. My chest tightened. The silence was unbearable. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and slammed it once, twice, until my palms stung. A raw sound tore out of me, something between a sob and a scream. All the hours, all the late nights, every solution that kept Hanlon's factories alive reduced to nothing in less than a minute. Tears blurred the dashboard lights. I wiped them away with the heel of my hand, furious at myself for letting Craig's smirk linger in my head. I gathered the box and stumbled upstairs, but once inside my apartment, I left it by the door like a suitcase I refused to unpack. At 6:07 p.m., my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed Hanlon HR. I declined. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again, then again. By 6:30, I had 9 missed calls. At 6:45:17, each voicemail piled onto the next, their tones growing sharper, more frantic. By 7, messages from people I barely knew filled my inbox. Marin, call the office, it's urgent. Please. I curled up on the couch, phone face down on the cushion beside me. I wanted silence, but the device buzzed until it rattled against the fabric like a living thing. At 8:00 sharp, a knock thundered on my apartment door. Not a polite tap, a pounding. My heart jolted. I crept to the peephole and froze. Alan Mercer, Hanlon's CEO, the man whose face had stared down from the framed posters in the lobby. Now he stood in my hallway, his tie loosened, sweat shining at his temple. "Marin," he said, his voice hoarse through the door. "Please, we need to talk." I stayed silent. 3 plants are down. Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Detroit. Production's stopped. We're bleeding millions every hour. We need you back. Now. His fist struck the door again, rattling the hinges. I leaned my forehead against the wood, heart pounding. The people who had erased me that morning were at my door by nightfall, begging for the same hands they'd just discarded. I don't know why I opened the door. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe the sheer disbelief of seeing Alan Mercer outside my apartment like a desperate salesman. He stepped in cautiously, glancing around my living room as if he expected chaos. "Nice place," he muttered, but the false pleasantry collapsed under the weight of his panic. He loosened his tie and sank into the edge of my sofa. "The production lines went down within an hour of you leaving," he admitted. "At first we thought it was coincidence, but now 3 plants frozen. Orders piling up. Our clients are furious." I crossed my arms. "And this is surprising to you." Alan blinked, thrown by my tone. He was used to me explaining things quietly in meetings, taking notes, fixing problems in silence. He wasn't used to hearing my anger. "Craig said your role was redundant. Craig doesn't understand what I do." I cut in. "None of you do." He tried to recover. "Then explain it to me now." "Why does everything fall apart without you?" I paced toward my desk and pointed at a stack of binders. "You've got an ERP system from the late 90s, an MES platform bolted on 10 years later, and an AS400 mainframe still running in Detroit. They don't speak the same language. They never did. I wrote the translation scripts. I scheduled the batch jobs at 4:30 every morning. I manually reconciled inventory when the system spat out contradictions. That's why your factories still ran." Alan's face drained of color. "All that wasn't documented. It was quarterly reports, presentations, emails. You ignored them because they weren't flashy or new. You hired consultants who sold you cloud dashboards and called me obsolete." He rubbed his temples. "Marin, listen, we can fix this. Come back, triple your salary. Immediate reinstatement. For the first time all day." I smiled, not kindly, but with a clarity that steadied me. "You think this is about money. You humiliated me in front of my team. You made my work invisible until it was gone. And now you want to buy me back like a spare part." His mouth opened, then closed. I could almost hear the hum of the dead factories in the silence between us. After Alan left, the apartment felt too quiet. His cologne still lingered faintly in the air, a reminder of desperation I never thought I'd see on him. I poured a glass of water, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the untouched cardboard box by the door. The offers, the pleading, all of it buzzed in my head. Triple my salary. Come back immediately. As if dignity were a commodity they could mark up and repurchase. I opened my laptop, but instead of drafting a resignation reply or scrolling through job boards, I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer. For years, I'd been scribbling notes to myself about how things could run if I weren't buried in someone else's hierarchy. Tonight, the notes became something sharper. At the top of the page, in thick block letters, I wrote Kessler Systems Integration. Underneath, I outlined the core, specialize in legacy system translation, emergency stabilization, documentation that executives couldn't ignore, teach companies to stop depending on invisible labor. My pen moved faster than I expected, anger fueling every line until the yellow paper was filled with arrows and underlines. By the time the clock hit midnight, I had the bones of a company. I reached for my phone. Raj Patel's number glowed in my contacts. Raj ran a consultancy downtown, always sharp in his navy suits, always asking if I'd consider joining him. I hit call. He answered groggy but alert. "Maureen, you okay?" "Better than I thought I'd be," I said. "They fired me this morning." By tonight, they were begging me to come back. But I'm not going back. Raj, not as an employee. A pause, then a low whistle. "About time you saw your worth. What's the plan? I'm starting my own firm. I want partnership, not a paycheck. You have clients struggling with integrations. Send them my way. I'll send you modernization work in return." For a moment, silence stretched across the line. Then Raj laughed softly. "You sound serious." "I've never been more serious," I said. By the time we hung up, the first outlines of my future sat in front of me, not a return to the shadows, but the first brick in something that finally belonged to me. By morning, the decision felt like steel in my chest. I printed a simple 2-page contract on my home printer, slipped it into a folder, and drove downtown. When Alan called again at 7:30, voice ragged, I cut him off mid-sentence. "I'll help," I said, "but not as your employee. My rate is $350 an hour. Minimum 100 hours prepaid. Wire confirmation before I step through the door." There was a stunned silence, then the hurried promise of immediate payment. By the time I reached Hanlon's headquarters, my phone pinged with the transfer notification, for the first time. They weren't dictating terms. The lobby receptionist looked startled as I signed in. The same badge clipped to my jacket, but under a different title now. Consultant. Independent. No box waiting for me this time. On the executive floor, chaos hummed like static. Assistants scurried between rooms. Papers fluttered. The so-called efficiency consultants hunched over whiteboards covered in jagged arrows and acronyms that made no sense. Alan ushered me into the war room where half the leadership team had gathered. At the front, CTO Garrett waved a marker, presenting a sprawl of systems architecture that looked like a child's attempt at modern art. "This is the root cause," he began. "Wrong," I said, stepping forward. Heads turned. I picked up the eraser and wiped away half the board. "You've drawn what you wish the systems looked like. Here's reality." I sketched quickly ERP here, MES there. The old S400 mainframe feeding data manually bridged every morning at 4:30. I marked the scripts that synced inventory, the manual overrides no one else even knew existed. Garrett flushed red. "Why wasn't this documented?" "It was," I replied evenly. "Quarterly. You dismissed it. For the next 10 days. I led from that room. I trained engineers, rebuilt scripts, installed temporary workarounds. Sleep came in short bursts. Coffee became currency. But by day 10, production was running at 80% capacity. Orders moved again. Plants breathed again. Investors calmed again. Each night, I packed my bag and walked out past executives who had once ignored me. Their eyes followed me now, not with dismissal, but with recognition, and every step toward the glass doors. I carried my dignity intact this time, on my terms. 10 days of firefighting at Hanlon proved more than one thing. Not only was my work indispensable, but there were countless others out there stuck in the same trap, invisible labor propping up failing systems. By the time the first contract ended, I knew I couldn't do it alone anymore. Naomi was the first call I made. She answered before the second ring. "You meant it." "Didn't you?" she said. "I need someone who can organize chaos." "Operations director." You, in her laugh, carried relief. "Name the day." 2 more hires followed James, a quiet systems architect whose brilliance had been buried under a manager who took credit for his fixes. And Carmen, an engineer whose contract work had been passed over for full-time offers because she didn't fit the culture. Both said yes without hesitation. Suddenly, Kessler Systems integration wasn't just an idea scribbled on yellow paper, it was a team. Word traveled fast. A supplier in Toledo, burned by months of failed software rollouts, signed with us for stabilization. A Detroit-based auto parts company followed after hearing we had rescued Hanlon from collapse. By the 3rd week, contracts stacked higher than I dared imagine. Then the call came from Palmer Industries, Hanlon's fiercest rival. Their VP of technology, calm and professional. "Didn't waste time. We've heard what you did for Hanlon. We'd like you to do the same for us, at a premium." I accepted the meeting. News traveled back to Hanlon before the ink was dry. One afternoon, a courier arrived at our rented office downtown with a thick envelope stamped Legal Department, a cease and desist. Hanlon claimed I was violating confidentiality, that working with Palmer constituted conflict of interest. I didn't panic. I drafted a reply that same night, a wrongful termination lawsuit. In it, I laid out not only how my firing had been orchestrated, but also data showing that during the reorganization, women and minority employees had been eliminated at twice the rate of white male staff. Attached were emails they hoped I had forgotten, including Craig's message calling me non-essential weeks before the official meeting. I sent the draft to their counsel with one line, "Pursue this, and I'll file in federal court by Monday." By Friday, the cease and desist was withdrawn. Our Palmer contract moved forward untouched. Success, I was learning, carried its own kind of weight. 3 months after leaving Hanlon, Kessler Systems integration had 5 clients and a reputation that grew faster than I could manage. My days blurred into 18-hour stretches, juggling staff, drafting contracts, and putting out fires. One night, the fire almost consumed us. A script I had written for a client in Detroit, a temporary bridge between 2 conflicting inventory systems, failed during a routine overnight run. By the time I woke, their warehouse showed inventory off by thousands of units. Trucks waited in loading bays with nothing to ship. The client's operations manager left a voicemail at 5:12 a.m., voice tight with fury. "If this isn't fixed by end of day, we're done." I drove to the office still in yesterday's clothes, coffee shaking in my hand. The team gathered in silence around my desk as I dug through error logs, chasing the bug line by line. For 6 hours, I heard only the clatter of keys and the pounding of my own heart. By late afternoon, I patched the failure and rebuilt the workflow, but the damage was real. Orders were delayed, tempers flared, and for the first time since this new life began, I felt the shadow of collapse leaning over me. Alone in my office, head in my hands, I wondered if I had overreached. That evening, my phone rang again. Not a client. Hanlon's board. The voice of Caroline West, the chairwoman, was calm, measured. "We've reviewed the situation. We believe Kessler Systems integration is too valuable to remain independent. We're prepared to acquire your firm for $25 million, plus a CTO position for you within Hanlon." The offer made my breath catch. It was more money than I had ever imagined, and yet, as I sat across from them days later in a boardroom lined with dark wood and leather, I felt the same pulse of humiliation I had carried from that morning with Craig. They expected me to fold, to call it victory, instead. I opened my folder and slid a single sheet across the table. A new contract, reduced rates, guaranteed response times, dedicated staff. Kessler Systems would remain independent. This is the deal, I said evenly. Take it, or find someone else to save you. 1 year later, the view from our office windows stretched across the Cuyahoga River, the lights of downtown Cleveland flickering against the glass. What had started as sketches on a yellow legal pad had become a floor buzzing with 55 specialists, integration architects, project managers, engineers who had once been overlooked just like me. Their conversations overlapped in a hum of purpose, keyboards clattering in rhythm. Hanlon was still a client, but no longer the center of my world. Their projects accounted for less than 30% of our revenue now, diluted by contracts across Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, auto parts, steel suppliers, even a pharmaceutical plant, all bound together by the same invisible threads we now made visible. That night, we gathered in our main conference room, tables cleared, food laid out in aluminum trays, bottles of champagne sweating in ice buckets. It was our anniversary, the first year of Kessler Systems integration. The chatter quieted as Naomi lifted her glass, her smile wide with a pride that made my throat ache. "To Marin," she said, her voice steady, to the woman who turned erasure into empire. The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinking, laughter breaking loose. I felt the heat rise to my face. But this time, it wasn't humiliation, it was recognition. As the celebration wound down, the receptionist hurried over with a delivery. A massive arrangement of lilies and orchids stood in the doorway, too large for one person to carry. Nestled among the blooms was a card embossed with Hanlon's new letterhead. "Respect earned is better than respect given. Congratulations on your success. Caroline West." I held the card a moment longer than necessary, the weight of those words pressing into my chest. Then I walked to the front of the office and set the flowers on the reception desk, where every client and visitor would see them first, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. I looked around at my team, laughing, debating, already planning tomorrow's fixes, and understood with a clarity I'd never had before. My worth had never belonged to Hanlon. It was mine, built line by line, system by system, choice by choice, and now it would never be theirs to define again.